this has been a great day. I hope you guys feel the same. I love it because I consider myself also a student. I'm always learning, so it's very exciting to learn a lot of things with Dr. Norgaard. I want to start by thanking the parents who made the effort to send the kids here today, to be here today. The parents made the effort to send the kids here today, to be here today as well. I also want to thank Dr. Norgaard for being here with us today. And I also want to thank two more people. I want to thank Ms. Kathleen Fieri today because without her providing this space, we could not have this workshop. So thank you, Ms. Fieri. Thank you. I also want to thank my husband, Paul Nan, for providing the sound system for us. It was very kind of him to bring all this stuff today to do that. So I want to thank my wonderful musicians. I also want to thank Ms. Katrina Roman, who took her time today. She was not even feeling well today, but she took the time to come this afternoon and be with us this afternoon. So thank you. So as some of you know, we're trying to, at least once a year, to have a workshop for the musicians in the orchestra. And I always try to choose something that explores the skill of improvisation. And the reason being is because I truly believe that a complete musician is the one who can, I don't want to say do it all, but somewhat have some kind of freedom with the instrument. They'll be able to read music, yes, and they'll be able to play style and so forth, but they'll also be able to just play freely and be able to improvise, have some knowledge of improvisation. After all, you know, Bach, Beethoven, all those great musicians from the past, they were able to improvise. So shouldn't we bring this skill back again? Let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Norgaard. Dr. Norgaard is an assistant professor of music education at Georgia State University in Atlanta. You know, it's a huge thing here with Dr. Norgaard. But one of the things that I like very much is that Dr. Norgaard, he does a lot of research with music and mind the brain. And he has done many, what do you call what that thing that you just did 2 weeks ago?
The symposium?
The symposium. Yeah. And he invites all those neuroscientists and people who work with the brain to understand how the brain works when you're improvising, you're creating music. I had a chance to attend that 2 years ago and it was fascinating. Dr. Norgaard was born and raised in Denmark. So he moved to the States to study jazz performance at William Patterson University and Queens College in New York, where his instructors include Rufus Reid, Hal Garper, Jimmy Heath, and others. He then moved to Nashville, where he taught jazz and commercial strings at Belmont University and Vanderbilt University. Then he directed the Belmont Jazz String Quartet and Jazz String Septet, which were featured at the International Association for Jazz Education 2001 conference. Prior to his appointment at Georgia State University, Dr. Norgaard received his PhD in music and human learning from the University of Texas at Austin, where he studied with Robert Tuke and Laurie Scott. So, thank you, Dr. Norgaard, for being here. I have a very short presentation to you. We're going to start with a piece, Georgia on My Mind, and then Dr. Norgaard will take over and show all of you what we worked on with molecules and stars, which is his composition that we'll be playing during our concert. So we're going to start with Georgia.
don't know if you guys can see this, but so what we did today for nearly the entire day was work on improvisation. So I started this morning by sharing some of the warm-up exercises that I do. When I practice, which is actually not that often anymore, I do mostly research, but you know, it's hard to do it all. But so one of the things that I find is very helpful with improvisation and, is when you get the students to think about what they do. So what I mean by that is that I think some of your students, they have these scale and etude books and they play the notes, but they don't really realize what they are. In other words, are they arpeggios? Do they fit in with the scales a certain way? And what we did was we came up with a bunch of exercises without having any book, right? And that means you have to think on your instrument. You have to think where the notes are, and you have to, you know, so there's a whole bunch of logic that you can do making up all these exercises. And then we improvised. So I showed them how to go from scale to improvisation. And I encouraged you guys to encourage them to do this at home. Because here's the problem with practicing scales, right? So if you play a G scale, you start on G and you go to G and you end on G. Well, why do we practice scales in the first place? Well, we practice scales because we assume that something that's scalar is going to come up in a piece of music, right? Well, do you think that piece of music always starts on G and ends on G? No, it doesn't, right? Because it starts somewhere in the middle of the scale, it goes up a little bit, and down a little bit, and up a little bit. So if you don't do that, then what's the point of practicing scales when that's not what you see in the music, right? So when you improvise, you start on various notes, and you go up and down the scale. You add skips, right? So you jump over notes, which is what's in music, right? So now your warm-up becomes what you're going to see in the music, right? Which is the whole point of the warm-up in the first place, right? So I believe that improvisation adds a type of flexibility that you don't have otherwise. And then the fact that you don't have to read music has the benefit, as some of you guys know, if you students are Suzuki trained, that by not looking at music, you're really more focused on other things. And that other thing very often is intonation, which is the hardest thing to do on this instrument because we don't have frets, right? And then after lunch, no, before lunch, we listened to a Miles Davis solo, famous jazz musician, and we found out that when he improvises, he changes register dynamic, he uses repetitions, he changes his durations, articulations, and that's how his solo makes sense. So it's not just a bunch of random notes, right? He starts maybe in a lower register, and then he goes up in register, and then lower in register. Well, what does that look like? Well, it looks like most stories, right? You know, on a sunny day there was a, right? And then it gets more and more exciting, and then it kind of tapers off in the end, right? And that's what we do with improvise. Now, with you guys that are going to improvise today, that probably won't happen because it takes a lot of practice. But that's some of the things that we're going to look for. So the most common problem with string players that improvise is that they just play all the time, right? So they never breathe. Well, why do the horn players don't have that problem? Because they have to breathe, right? And when you breathe, you have to select where you take a breath, and you take a breath between phrases, right? Well, now you have to figure out what a phrase is, right? So those are some of the other things we talked about. But anyway, so we really worked on that nearly for the entire day, and we worked a little bit on the actual piece. I just thought about this. I'm going to go ahead and play the very last solo. Okay, so after your solo, we're just going to keep going. So the last section is going to be really long. You're just going to have to watch. Okay? Not that I think we're going to use, so these were just the soloists that I worked on. I also did some private lessons, kind of master class setting with some students, and those were the students that wanted to do that. So we just popped them on this little, what do you call it, workshop type of concept. So here we go. This is my piece, Molecules of Stars. because that's where I was unclear whether we were going on. So play a little bit more your solo, and then I'll very clearly say when we go on to 77, 77. My fault, my fault. 2, on, 2, ready, and. keep track of solos, which is, you know, sometimes do you want the solos to keep going? It seems like somebody is in the middle of it, so that's some of the things that you need to decide for the final concert. Is if somebody is in the middle of the solo, do you let them go and then possibly throw off the orchestra as I did, right? Because I was like, okay, in the middle of the solo, I don't want to stop the solo, right? So there's some of the decisions when you have somebody playing something that's not written out in the middle of the piece. Okay. So there you go. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you. Thank you.
No, of course not.
Can we all stand up and let's take a picture of Dr. Norgaard? Let's get very close. My little group right up to you, so let's get very close.
president of the orchestra.